Jake Mitchell wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble. A quiet farmer living just outside the pristine gates of Crestwood Estates, he believed in minding his own business, tending his land, and respecting others who did the same. His farm had been in the family for generations, a legacy built with weathered hands and sun-scorched backs. Every morning, Jake would sit on his wooden porch, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug, staring out across the golden fields as the early light dawned across rows of crops. The rooster would crow like clockwork, the animals stirred, and the scent of fresh earth filled the air. To Jake, it was paradise. To Karen Whitmore, it was an eyesore. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association, a position she held with the sort of zeal most people reserved for certain prosecutors or war generals. She had an unnatural obsession with rules she often made up, and a pathological need to enforce them. Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, silent streets, and trimmed hedges were her gospel. Anything outside of that pristine, sterilized vision was a threat. Jake's farm, with its proud red barn, roaming chickens, and gravel driveway, might as well have been a personal insult. The first time Karen visited Jake's property, she arrived like a storm disguised in beige. She wore a crisp pantsuit, clutched a clipboard like it was a weapon, and carried herself with the smug confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Jake had just sat down with his coffee, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, when he saw her SUV roll up. He watched her get out, straighten her blazer, and march up the porch steps as if she owned the place. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she said in a clipped tone, her eyes scanning the porch like she expected it to be covered in animal droppings. Jake nodded slowly, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates HOA. I'd like to have a quick word about your property." Jake took a slow sip of coffee before replying. "Didn't know my property was part of Crestwood." Karen's smile was tight, polite, and utterly fake. "Technically, it's not, but your farm borders our community, and several residents have raised concerns about the visual impact of your land." Jake set his coffee down and leaned forward, confused and mildly entertained. "Visual impact?" she continued, as if that explained everything. "The red barn, the noise from the animals, particularly the rooster. It's disrupting the peaceful aesthetic we strive for. We believe your property would benefit from some adjustments." Jake let out a laugh, short and amused. "Adjustments? You mean paint the barn beige and teach the rooster to crow on command?" Karen's lips thinned. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. We all want a harmonious community." Jake stood, stretching his back, the smirk never leaving his face. "Ms. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not part of your HOA. My farm's been here long before Crestwood ever existed. I'm not violating any county laws, and my land, my barn, and my animals aren't hurting anyone." Karen's face hardened. "We'll see about that," she muttered before turning and storming back to her vehicle, heels clicking against the wooden porch like gunfire. Jake watched her leave, still amused, but deep down, he had a feeling this wouldn't be the last he saw of her. It didn't take long for Karen to prove him right. Within a week, formal letters started arriving, printed on official HOA letterhead, each one more absurd than the last. Demands that he repaint his barn, eliminate unnecessary livestock, and cease auditory disturbances before sunrise. Jake pinned the letters on his fridge like trophies, each one a new badge of nonsense. He laughed them off at first, confident that they held no legal weight. After all, his farm wasn't within HOA boundaries. He was a free man on his own land. But Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. Her next move came with backup. One sunny afternoon, as Jake repaired a fence post near the southern edge of his land, he heard voices approaching. He turned to see Karen again, this time flanked by two other HOA board members. One a wiry man with a permanent frown and thick-rimmed glasses, the other a nervous woman who clutched her purse like a shield. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and raised an eyebrow as they approached. "Mr. Mitchell," Karen said with a sigh, as if she were dealing with a stubborn child, "I was hoping we could resolve this amicably, but you continue to ignore our requests." Jake folded his arms, trying not to laugh. "That's because your requests are insane." Karen ignored the comment and handed him another piece of paper. "As per HOA regulations," Jake cut her off. "I'm not in your HOA. You have no jurisdiction here." Karen's voice tightened. "As per HOA regulations, All properties within visual proximity to Crestwood must adhere to community aesthetic standards. Jake snorted. Visual proximity? That's a new one. The wiry man jumped in. We've been in contact with county officials about potential zoning issues. If your property is found in violation, you may be subject to fines. Jake's amusement faded slightly. He knew his farm was in compliance, but the mention of involving the county told him Karen wasn't bluffing about making trouble. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound dangerous. You go ahead and contact whoever you want. But if you or anyone from your little club steps foot on my property again without my say-so, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing. Karen's mask cracked for just a second before she collected herself. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Jake shook his head. No, you are. Then he turned his back on her, walking away without another word. If Jake had thought that would be the end of it, he was sorely mistaken. The battle lines had been drawn. Karen had declared war on the Mitchell farm, and Jake, though he didn't know it yet, was about to become the town's most unexpected folk hero in a war of petty grievances, absurd complaints, and one man's refusal to back down. The first formal letter was annoying, but by the third one, Jake had turned it into a game. He'd come in from feeding the animals, wipe the dust off his boots, grab the mail, and chuckle at whatever new absurdity Karen had sent that day. One letter complained about his barn being too vibrant and disruptive to community harmony. Another claimed his roosters crowing constituted a noise violation, even though it was nature doing what nature did. The best one so far suggested that he consider relocating his livestock to a more community-friendly area. Jake had pinned each of these gems to the side of his fridge, calling it his wall of nonsense. He figured that eventually, Karen would tire herself out. She hadn't yet. It didn't stop at letters. Jake began to notice an uptick in unexpected visits from county departments. One day it was the health inspector, clipboard in hand, and looking confused before he even stepped out of the truck. The next, it was someone from zoning enforcement, asking vague questions about land use. Then came a woman from Animal Welfare Services, sent to investigate a tip about neglected and improperly housed animals. Jake offered each of them coffee, gave them a tour, and sent them off with a friendly wave and a stack of completely clean reports. None of the visits ever led to citations or findings. His farm was spotless. But the frequency of these visits told him something else. Someone was working hard behind the scenes to weaponize bureaucracy, and Jake didn't have to guess who. The health inspector, an older gentleman named Roger, gave Jake a knowing look as he scribbled notes on his last visit. This place is cleaner than most of the restaurants I inspect, he muttered. Jake smiled. Wouldn't happen to be getting a lot of complaints from a certain HOA president, would you? Roger looked up and scratched the back of his neck. Off the record? Yeah, her name's on every one of these. We've been running in circles, son. Jake just shook his head and thanked him for stopping by. Still, it was irritating. Jake could brush off the pettiness for a while, but he couldn't ignore that Karen was now actively trying to make his life miserable, not just by complaining, but by dragging the county into her personal vendetta. Then things took a darker turn. One afternoon, while Jake was working near the south fence line, he heard a sound he hadn't expected, a chainsaw, not from his own tool shed, but further down the edge of his property, near the dividing line between his farm and the HOA community. He set down his tools and walked toward the noise, heart pounding with suspicion. As he drew closer, the scene made his stomach churn. A crew of hired workers was erecting a massive steel fence, and not just on the HOA side of the property line. They were several feet into Jake's land. He picked up his pace and stormed over. The crew paused when they saw him coming, but one man kept working, pretending not to notice. Jake didn't address them at first. His eyes locked on Karen, who stood nearby with her ever-present clipboard, supervising like a general inspecting her troops. Her smile when she saw him was infuriating. What the hell do you think you're doing? Jake demanded, gesturing at the partly built structure. Karen blinked, all faux innocence. Just implementing some improvements to preserve the community's visual aesthetics. This new privacy fence will benefit everyone. Jake turned to the crew. This fence is on my land. Karen's tone turned slippery. That's debatable. We reviewed some older survey maps and believe the original property lines were drawn incorrectly. Until we receive clarification, we're proceeding with the project. Jake's jaw clenched. You believe? That's your justification for trespassing and building on land that isn't yours. He walked up to the nearest worker, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. You boys got a permit for this? The man shifted awkwardly. The HOA told us they had all the permissions. Jake didn't break eye contact. They don't. And if you don't stop work and leave right now, I'll be calling the sheriff, and you'll be the ones charged with trespassing. The chainsaw was shut off. Slowly, the workers began gathering their equipment, clearly not willing to risk jail over a neighborhood feud. Karen, however, was still standing tall, her smile replaced by something more brittle. You can't just order them to leave, she snapped. This is a community project. Jake took out his phone and started dialing. Then let's make it official. We'll let the county sort it out. Karen froze. There's no need for that, she said quickly. Then I suggest you tell your people to pack it up. She hesitated for a moment, jaw tight, then turned and barked at the workers to leave. The half-built fence project was dead before it began. Jake didn't let it end there. That night, he dug out every deed, every document related to the land survey, and made multiple copies. The next morning, he sent them, along with a formal cease and desist letter, to the HOA board. The message was clear: set foot on my land again, and I will press charges. For a few days, things were quiet. Jake thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally gotten the message. He underestimated her persistence. A week later, Jake came out to grab his morning paper and stopped dead in his tracks. Right near the road, planted boldly in front of his fence, was a massive real estate sign, in huge red letters, for sale. Below that, a second sign, under negotiation, coming soon to Crestwood Estates. Jake stood there stunned for a moment. He actually considered whether he might be losing his mind. Had someone truly decided to put his farm on the market without his knowledge? Before he could even call anyone, Karen appeared, as if summoned by sheer arrogance. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said with a too bright smile. "I see you've noticed the sign. There's been a little mix-up, a misunderstanding really." Jake stared at her. "Misunderstanding?" She nodded, her tone syrupy. "We've been discussing property expansion within the HOA. Some of the realtors assumed your farm was included. A minor error, I'm sure." Jake crossed his arms. "You're telling me a real estate agency just accidentally listed my land for sale?" Karen's smile wavered, but she pushed through. "Well, perhaps there was some enthusiasm about the idea. Your property is perfectly positioned for Crestwood's future vision." Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he took a slow step forward and looked her dead in the eye. "You're going to call whoever put that sign up and tell them never to step foot on my land again. Because if I see another one, I won't be tearing it down. I'll be suing the HOA for fraud." Karen opened her mouth, but he cut her off again. "And don't think for a second I won't involve the county." Her eyes narrowed, and she turned with a huff, stomping back toward her car. The sign came down that same day. Jake had dealt with stubborn livestock, unpredictable storms, and backbreaking harvest seasons. But none of those things compared to the sheer audacity of this woman. She wasn't just trying to bully him anymore. She was trying to erase him, to act like he didn't even exist, like his land, his history, his identity could just be absorbed into her carefully curated world. What Karen didn't realize was that Jake was done playing defense. From this point on, he wasn't just going to hold his ground. He was going to make damn sure she regretted ever picking this fight. Jake knew that waiting around for Karen to stop was no longer an option. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to back down, and now, after the stunt with the real estate sign, he had all the proof he needed that she wasn't just trying to harass him. She was trying to take what wasn't hers. That was a line Jake refused to let anyone cross. So he stopped playing defense. If she wanted a war, he was going to give her one, but on his terms, with his weapons, and with the kind of stubborn resilience only a farmer who'd worked his land since childhood could muster. The first thing he did was gather his arsenal, not of tools or weapons, but of paperwork. Jake drove straight to the county records office and requested every single document tied to his farm. He pulled deeds, zoning permits, land surveys, and agricultural exemptions going back decades. He made copies of everything, organized them in labeled folders, and even had a set laminated for good measure. If Karen came at him again, she'd be facing more than just resistance. She'd be staring down old, undeniable proof. Next, Jake reached out to Sheriff Tom Coldwell. Tom wasn't just the law in that county. He was also a family friend. Their fathers had worked together on the local irrigation project back in the 70s, and Tom had spent enough time on Jake's porch drinking sweet tea to know Jake was no troublemaker. When Jake told him the full story, right down to the fake real estate listing and the illegal fence attempt, Tom's face went from amused to furious. "You're telling me she tried to claim your land?" tried to sell it off like it was hers. Jake nodded. And I've got the documents to prove it. Tom sighed, shaking his head. You let me know if she so much as sneezes in your direction again. I'll make sure the next visit from law enforcement isn't a friendly one. With his defenses fortified, Jake turned to something he'd been thinking about for a while: payback. Not revenge in the dirty sense, but something far more satisfying. He remembered how Karen had hated his roosters crowing. She'd called it disruptive, uncivilized, and bad for property values. Well, if one rooster was bad, he figured 3 more would be downright unbearable. So Jake made a trip to a local farm and came back with 3 new roosters, loud, proud, and ready to greet the sun. He set up a new morning routine. Every day at 5 a.m., the chorus of crowing began, echoing through the valley and bouncing off the cookie-cutter homes of Crestwood Estates. The noise was glorious, but Jake wasn't done. If Karen thought his fields were an eyesore, he would turn them into a spectacle. He bought hundreds of sunflower seeds and planted them along the entire property line shared with Crestwood. Within weeks, tall, golden stalks towered like a natural fence, their broad heads turning toward the sun. Not only did it block the view of his barn from Karen's pristine neighborhood, but it also became a hit with the local bees, birds, and children. Kids started riding their bikes to the edge of the farm just to peek at the sunflower wall. Adults stopped to take pictures. Jake stood at the edge of his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sunflower tops in hues of fire, and he smiled. If Karen wanted to drown in her own bitterness, he'd give her a bright, blooming reminder of everything she hated. Then came the idea that took things to the next level. Jake had a friend named Mason who ran the local farmers market. One evening over beers, Jake asked him, "What if we didn't wait for people to come to town? What if we brought the market here?" Mason's eyes lit up. "You're talking about turning your land into an event space?" Jake nodded. "Just once a week. A little something for the community. Music, animals, food. And you know the best part? It's all perfectly legal." It didn't take much to set it up. Jake cleared an area near the barn, built some simple booths out of reclaimed wood, and put up flyers in the diner, post office, and grocery store. He called it Farms Fun Day: free entry, fresh produce, petting zoo for the kids, and live music from local bands. The first weekend was a hit. Families poured in, kids ran around petting goats and chasing chickens, and people bought up every egg, tomato, and jar of jam available. Local musicians played bluegrass and country tunes from the back of a flatbed truck, and Mason grilled burgers for the crowd. It was exactly the kind of wholesome chaos that made Jake's heart full. It was also, predictably, Karen's worst nightmare. Sure enough, around mid-afternoon, Karen arrived in a flurry of indignation. Her clipboard was in one hand, her phone in the other, as she stormed across the field. "This is completely unacceptable," she shouted, her voice straining over the music. "You can't turn your farm into a carnival." Jake met her halfway, arms folded, grinning like a man who just won the lottery. "Actually, I can. Checked with the county myself. Fully legal, zoned for agricultural tourism." Karen's eyes twitched. "But the noise, the parking, the livestock, it's all approved," Jake interrupted. "And the community loves it." He gestured to the laughing families and happy children. "You should try a burger. They're fantastic." Karen sputtered but had no comeback. She turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering about calling the board. Jake watched her go with satisfaction. But the fun didn't stop there. After that first event, Jake made it weekly. Each Saturday, the farm came alive with visitors, vendors, and music. His land, once labeled an eyesore by Karen, had become the community's favorite weekend escape. People came from neighboring towns. Kids begged their parents to go back, and Karen, unable to stop it, was forced to endure the sight of her pristine neighborhood being outshined by the very farm she tried to destroy. Still, Jake wasn't foolish. He knew Karen wasn't finished, so he installed a few cameras, nothing too obvious, just enough to keep an eye on things. That's how he caught the man with the drone. One evening, as he fed the goats, he spotted it hovering just above his property line, zooming in on his barn, his animals, his guests. He followed it to a black SUV parked discreetly near the road. Inside was a man with a camera and a notepad, clearly documenting something. Jake walked right up and knocked on the window. The man rolled it down slowly. "Just checking on a local property dispute," he said, too casually. Jake laughed. "Yeah, well, you can check from public land. Any closer, and you're trespassing." Later that night, another letter arrived in his mailbox. This one accused him of unsanitary conditions, excessive noise, and possible zoning infractions related to his events. Jake didn't even finish reading it before he picked up the phone and called his lawyer. It was time to hit back the right way. No more tolerance, no more warnings. He had the video, the documents, and the witnesses. Karen had crossed too many lines, and Jake was done letting her think she could get away with it. He had one more move planned, and it was going to be big. Not loud or petty this time. Something final, public, and impossible to ignore. Karen had underestimated Jake at every turn, and now she was about to find out what happened when a man like him decided to fight back, not just with pride, but with precision. The fun and games were over. Now it was time for consequences. Word spread faster than fire in a dry cornfield. What had started as a petty feud between a farmer and a homeowners association president had turned into the town's most entertaining drama. Jake wasn't the only one dealing with Karen's overreach, but he was the only one who'd stood up to her publicly, loudly, and with undeniable flair. It didn't take long before the ripple effects of his defiance began shaking the very walls of Crestwood Estates. And within those perfectly painted walls, something unexpected was brewing, a quiet rebellion. At first, there were whispers. Neighbors who once avoided Jake or pretended not to notice his existence started giving him nods of approval at the grocery store. A few even waved when driving past the sunflower wall that now stood proudly between the farm and the HOA line. But then came Linda Matthews, a woman who had lived in Crestwood since the first row of homes was built. She had once served on the HOA board, long before Karen muscled her way to the top. One afternoon, she appeared on Jake's porch with a homemade apple pie in hand and a sly smile that said more than words ever could. Jake looked her over and said with a smirk, "Didn't figure you HOA folks were the pie gifting type." Linda chuckled, placed the pie down, and leaned on the railing beside him. "You don't know it yet, Jake, but you're doing God's work. Some of us are just too scared to say it out loud." Linda wasn't bluffing. She had stories. Fines for her mailbox being 2 inches too tall, threats over leaving her holiday wreath up a week past Christmas. She had even been reprimanded because her grandson had drawn hopscotch squares on the driveway with chalk. Karen had ruled Crestwood like a dictator, using her clipboard and interpretation of the HOA handbook as a sword. People hadn't fought back because fighting meant fines, letters, and public shaming. But now, seeing Jake stand up and not back down had stirred something in the others. It gave them courage. Over the next few days, more residents quietly reached out to Jake. They didn't come storming in with pitchforks, but they brought coffee, old newsletters, copies of board meeting notes, and more pies than Jake knew what to do with. One of them was Greg, an older veteran with a limp and a deadpan sense of humor. He showed up one evening carrying a manila folder and a grin that practically dripped with mischief. "Thought you might find this interesting," he said, handing Jake the folder. Inside were copies of internal HOA emails leaked from someone within the board. Greg tapped the top page. "Karen's been filing fake complaints. When the county started ignoring hers, she began using made-up names, pretending to be different residents." Jake read through the emails slowly, eyebrows raising higher with each page. She had gone as far as forging complaints from fictional homeowners about smells, noise, and even visual discomfort caused by the red paint on the barn. Greg wasn't done. She also tried to pass a special assessment. She wanted every homeowner in Crestwood to pay a one-time fee so the HOA could hire a lawyer and sue you. Jake blinked, stunned. She really thought people would go for that. Greg laughed. She tried. Didn't go over well. People started asking why they were paying to fight someone who didn't even live in the neighborhood. That was when folks started seeing her for what she really was. It was clear now that the tides were shifting. Some of the more level-headed HOA members began distancing themselves from Karen. At first, it was subtle. Missed meetings, unanswered emails. But then it became open. A few even apologized to Jake. One woman, Masha, dropped off a note saying she was sorry for ever believing Karen's nonsense. She ended it with a line that made Jake chuckle for hours. "I used to hate the rooster. Now I miss him when he doesn't crow." The town itself joined in the spectacle. The local Facebook group lit up with posts and memes about the feud. People who didn't even live in Crestwood took sides, most of them rooting for the farmer. Comments like, "I'd rather hear a rooster than deal with a nosy HOA president," flooded every thread. A waitress at the diner renamed menu items after the feud. The Karen special became a dry chicken sandwich with no seasoning. The Jake burger was a juicy, fully loaded cheeseburger with extra bacon. Even the local newspaper ran a small column titled "The War on the Fence Line," turning the saga into a weekly update. Karen, unsurprisingly, was not amused. She tried to push back harder, sending more letters, calling emergency board meetings, and insisting on stricter enforcement of HOA rules. But the support she once had was crumbling beneath her. People ignored her demands, skipped meetings, and whispered behind her back. She was losing her grip, and it was showing. She grew more frantic, her actions more desperate. That's when Jake knew the end was near. She had pushed too far for too long, and the people she ruled over were no longer afraid. Then she pulled a final stunt that crossed the line once again. Jake woke up one morning to find that every single road leading to his farm had been lined with new signs. Big, bold, and completely fabricated. Private road. No trespassing. HOA property. She was now trying to claim the public road that led to his land, attempting to isolate him entirely. Jake stared at the signs, equal parts furious and impressed by the sheer lunacy. She was spiraling, and this time she had gone too far. Jake made a few calls. By mid-afternoon, a county official had arrived. The man was already familiar with Karen's name, and from the look on his face, she'd tested his patience one too many times. Not only did the HOA have zero authority over public roads, but their attempt to install the signs was illegal. Within hours, the signs were gone, and Karen received a formal warning from the county for interfering with public infrastructure. That was strike 3, and the HOA board finally had enough. Linda texted Jake that night. "It's happening. Emergency vote. They are removing her." Jake didn't even need to be there. The board voted, and by the end of the evening, Karen was out, stripped of her title, no longer the voice of the HOA. It was over. The woman who had tried everything from fake lawsuits to illegal fences was finally done. And not just politically, socially. Her name was mud in the community. The next morning, her house was up for sale. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Jake didn't gloat, didn't throw a party. But the next Saturday, Farms Fun Day had a record turnout. Someone brought a homemade banner that read, "Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. Jake hung it near the barn and didn't say a word about it. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a win for him. It was a win for every neighbor she had ever bullied, every grandkid who'd been told to stop drawing chalk, every overwatered lawn fined for being too green. Karen may have started this war with a clipboard, but Jake ended it with sunflowers, roosters, and a whole town standing behind him. Jake didn't bother showing up to the emergency HOA meeting where Karen's reign finally crumbled. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and the fire she'd started had turned on her. Crestwood's residents, once meek and acquiescent under her rule, had finally seen through her facade. They weren't just angry at the harassment. They were embarrassed by how far she'd taken things. Jake stayed home, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun slip behind the sunflower wall that had become a symbol of his quiet rebellion. He didn't need to be in that room to know how it would go. The people were fed up. Karen had overplayed her hand. Inside the community center, the turnout was bigger than any previous HOA meeting. People who had never once attended came to see what would happen. Some brought copies of Jake's cease and desist letter. Others held printouts of the county's warning over the illegal road signs. But the most powerful evidence was Karen's own actions. Richard, the HOA president who had tolerated Karen for far too long, finally spoke with authority. He laid out the facts one by one. How Karen had fabricated complaints, misused HOA resources, attempted to claim land that wasn't hers, and embarrassed the entire neighborhood. Karen, sitting at the head of the table as if she still had power, tried to interject. She called the accusations ridiculous, claimed she was just trying to preserve the neighborhood's integrity. But no one was listening anymore. Greg, the veteran who had given Jake the internal emails, stood up and called her out directly. He accused her of manipulating the board, lying to residents, and using her position to fight a personal vendetta. One by one, other voices joined in. Linda reminded everyone of the petty fines and rules Karen had enforced, of how people had lived in fear of mailbox heights and garden gnomes. Another man brought up the incident with the drone and how Karen had hired someone to spy on Jake, crossing a line no one was comfortable with. Even those who once supported her were now distancing themselves, unwilling to go down with her. Then Richard made it official. He held up a thick folder of documented evidence, all of it provided by Jake and others who had grown tired of Karen's antics. As of tonight, Richard said firmly, Karen is no longer authorized to represent this HOA in any capacity. Karen sat frozen, her hands clenched, her face pale with fury and disbelief. She tried to argue, to protest, but the vote had already happened. She had been removed. Her voice, once so loud and controlling, had lost its power in the face of her own consequences. Richard added one final blow. Karen, I suggest you consider listing your home for sale. After everything you've done, it's clear no one here wants you around anymore. And just like that, it was over. Karen's reign ended not with the fight she expected, but with the collective will of people she had pushed too far. The very next morning, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. Rumor had it she was not just leaving Crestwood Estates, but leaving town altogether. No one came to help her pack. No one stopped to say goodbye. A few people watched from their porches, sipping coffee like they were watching the final episode of a long, dramatic series. Jake didn't watch. He didn't need to. Instead, he was busy putting up a new sign along the edge of his property, facing the road that led into Crestwood. It was big, wooden, hand-carved, and painted with bold black letters. Welcome to Mitchell Farms. No HOA. No Karens. No problem. That sign quickly became a local landmark. People stopped to take pictures next to it. Teens made it a backdrop for prom photos. Tourists who heard the story from friends in town came to see the infamous farm that had stood its ground. With Karen gone, Crestwood Estates began to change almost overnight. The tension that had hovered over the neighborhood like a storm cloud finally lifted. Residents began loosening the invisible chains they had lived under for years. Lawns grew freely without the threat of violation notices. Families left their trash bins out without fear of a passive-aggressive letter. Children played without being scolded. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was finally becoming a community. For Jake, life returned to its own rhythm. His farmer's market continued to thrive, drawing in people from all over the county. The fields bloomed brighter, the laughter of children filled the weekends, and the roosters crowed proudly each morning. The HOA board, now under new leadership, surprised Jake with a formal apology. It was signed by every member who remained after the chaos and mailed to him with a handwritten note from Richard himself. Jake framed it and hung it right next to the cease and desist letter Karen had once sent him, a reminder of how far things had come and how absurd they had once been. One evening, Linda and a few former HOA rebels stopped by with a basket of fresh-baked goods. "We figured we owed you a proper apology," she said, handing Jake a homemade pie. Jake leaned against the porch railing and raised an eyebrow. "What's this? An HOA making peace? Never thought I'd see the day." Linda laughed. "Without Karen breathing down our necks, things are a little different." Ted, a quiet man who rarely spoke, cleared his throat and added, "Honestly, Jake, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We just didn't want to end up on Karen's hit list." Jake nodded slowly. Understandable. She had a way of making life hell. "But now that she's gone," Linda said, "we were thinking maybe a fresh start? No more fighting." Jake thought for a moment, watching the last of the sunlight dip behind the barn. "As long as no one tries to annex my land again, I think we can call a truce." The group chuckled, and just like that, years of hostility began to fade into something new, something peaceful. But karma wasn't finished with Karen. A few weeks later, news trickled back through the town. Karen had moved to another HOA-run community in a different part of the state, convinced she could rebuild her little empire. What she hadn't realized was that the new neighborhood already had an enforcer, a woman just as strict and power-hungry as Karen had once been. Within weeks, Karen found herself on the receiving end of everything she used to dish out. She was fined for her grass being half an inch too tall, for parking too close to the curb, and for leaving her trash bins out overnight. The new HOA president didn't tolerate nonsense, and the second Karen tried to assert herself or push for a leadership role, she was shut down so hard it left her stunned. It wasn't long before she put her house back on the market. Word was, she couldn't handle living under someone else's rules. Jake heard the news from Linda one morning over coffee. She grinned as she read the message aloud, and Jake just shook his head, chuckling. "Poetic justice," he said. "A full circle served cold." Meanwhile, Mitchell Farms continued to grow. Families came every weekend. Vendors lined up to be part of the event, and Jake's once quiet farm had become a symbol of freedom and community. Even former Crestwood residents who had once feared Karen's wrath were now regulars at the market, buying eggs and vegetables from the man who had reminded everyone that peace, when defended with grit and humor, always wins in the end. Jake never saw Karen again.